Hello, my name is Jakub Bijak from the University of Southampton, and I would like to thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast of a briefing on how not to predict migration. This recording was made on the 8th of December 2015, with presentations to an audience of interested parties in the Palace of Westminster. The briefing was kindly chaired and sponsored by Mr. Paul Blomfield MP, Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Migration. The first speaker you will hear is myself, followed by Mrs. Madeleine Sampson, Director of the Migration Observatory at Oxford University, and the final speaker is Professor Philip Rees, Emeritus Professor of Geography at the University of Leeds. I hope you enjoy the briefing. Should you wish to find out more information, please follow the links below.
So the aim of today's meeting is to explore the issue of uncertainty of migration forecast and its policy implications, and we're going to focus on ways in which migration predictions can be reported in an honest way and used practically despite that uncertainty. And I'm delighted that the Centre for Population Change at the University of Southampton has suggested that we do that. The All-Party Parliamentary Group, of which I chair, of which Stuart is a member, of which Baroness Hamway there is a member, exists to try to encourage evidence-based discussion around migration issues, something which is often a challenge, to take some of the heat out of the debate and to try and get some more information into it. And I have to say, having spent much of the last 6 weeks sitting on the Public Bill Committee for the Immigration Bill in the House of Commons, and that underlines the challenge that personal reflection is that has been an excellent example of bad lawmaking, in that we heard from a range of expert witnesses demonstrating how key proposals in the bill would be at least impact neutral and in many ways counterproductive to the government's own policy objectives. And I guess that much of the way in which politics gets up a cul-de-sac on migration issues is because we don't have sufficiently honest discussion around population change and around migration into the UK. Governments gets boxed into unrealistic targets based on inadequately recorded numbers. So I'm really delighted that we're focusing on this issue today, because I think it's an essential prerequisite to having a mature discussion as a society, reflected here, on how we do manage migration within the UK and how we plan for the consequences of it. Because if we recognise that the problem in a sense that we have at the moment is that we pretend that we're reducing net migration, we don't, but we don't plan for the consequences, and therefore we're facing a fairly toxic public discourse around some of those issues. So we're going to have 3 presentations. Firstly from Dr. Jakub Bijak, who is at the SLC Centre for Population Change at the University of Southampton, and he's going to be talking about the work done recently by the Migration Advisory Committee on the predictability of migration. Followed by Madeleine Sampson, who is the head of the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, and as I was saying earlier, an organisation which many of us look to for providing helpful commentary around migration issues. And then finally, Professor Philip Rees from the University of Leeds. So we'll kick off with Jakub.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank Paul and the EPG Migration for hosting us in such a wonderful venue this morning. What we do as part of our work with the ESRC Centre for Population Change, we look at demographic uncertainty. So we look at what we don't know about the future population and population processes, and we're trying to come up with sensible ideas as to what we might still be able to do and what we still might be able to tell to the policymakers in the light of we don't know, so in the light of the demographic uncertainty. So as such, this talk will be about predictability. This talk will be about the predictability of the worst predictable element of the population puzzle, which is migration. And we'll look at the question of how to predict or how not to predict migration, and we'll also have a look at whether it is a right question to ask at all. There are several problems that are interlinked in this debate. So, first of all, we know that migration is uncertain. We know from the literature migration is the most uncertain element of demographic dynamics. But also we know that we need migration forecasts, for example, to feed into the population forecasts. Because we can't predict population without predicting one of the main components of change. So we need migration forecasts. What we also know is that the assumptions that are being made on migration in the future are typically very orderly, very aesthetic, very nice. Whereas migration isn't so. And this leads to the third problem. So when faced with such a complex phenomenon and process like migration, and when trying to predict it, and when trying to control it, we are faced with a policy dilemma. How to make migration policies that would work. And is it at all possible? There is a famous paper by Stephen Castles entitled Why Migration Policies Fail. It doesn't ask, do they fail? It asks why. So, migration policies is by no means the only area of demographic policies which fails to meet the expectations. Think of attempt to raise fertility in many European countries. They are equally problematic. But today we'll focus on migration. So, as introduced before, I'd like to share with you some of the results of the project that we have been doing last year for the Migration Advisory Committee. And of course, this is what I'll be talking about is our own views and interpretation rather than those of the MAP or the Home Office. And very briefly, the project had two main aims. The first one was to evaluate the existing approaches to predicting migration, of course with focus on the United Kingdom. And secondly, to assess the uncertainty of the different methods of forecasting. So we looked at the literature, but we also looked at the empirical data. And the approach we took is we tried to forecast the past that we already know and see how much error do we get when we apply different methods to the data that we have. So in the empirical analysis, we compared what we already knew with what would have been forecast a few years back if we used different methods. And we looked at the errors, but we also looked at, excuse the jargon, how well calibrated the errors were. So how good were our assessments of the uncertainty of these errors. I'll start with presenting you just a snapshot of the situation with the past official migration assumptions in the national population projections for the UK. What we have here on this graph is this downward sloping line is an average error of migration assumptions by forecast horizon, so or by projection horizon. So and the more negative it gets, it means that migration gets higher and higher and higher than it was envisaged. And this looks at projections from 1970s up until the 2012. That was the last available at the time we did the work. So a few things stand out from this graph. First, the further we go into the future, the longer the horizon, of course, the higher the uncertainty. So we know less and less as we go into the future. And also the migration assumptions weren't terribly successful overall. And interestingly, back until the mid-1980s, the migration assumptions in the national population projections were consistently negative. And the justification for that was, and it is actually still can be found in the materials that have been published to accompany the national population projections at the time, was that who would envisage net migration becoming positive? It was beyond the imagination of the assumption makers of the time, and we are talking about just 30 years ago. So, migration comes with lots of surprises. I will show you a few examples of the work we did, and altogether we carried out about 200 forecasting exercises based on a range of data sources that were available to us. And we also repeated this forecasting exercise twice for each approach. Once we truncated the data in 2003, so just before the enlargement of the European Union, and the other time we truncated the series in 2008, so just before the economic crisis. So we wanted to test the various forecasting methods in a quite challenging circumstances. And here we have just a small sample from those 200 forecasts that we made. So you will see some of them were okay. Well, none of them actually produced an error-free forecast. That would be impossible. But some of them, as here we have the immigration of British nationals, truncated in 2003, which if we forecasted into the future, at least the error bounds that we produced were deemed to be a reasonable approximation of what actually happened. So the actual migration flows for the British nationals coming back to the country were well within those error bounds. And this was a rarity. More often, were we getting other types of situations. So either, in some cases, we were not predicting as well as in this example of the British nationals. So here is the immigration from the old European Union member states, including some additional economic covariates to enhance the forecasting model, which didn't fare too badly. It didn't fare as well as this one. The errors were larger and they were not so well calibrated, but it was still deemed okay. But then there were instances where the forecast completely missed what happened later on, and they were actually in the majority. So, and many things could have gone wrong here. Either the errors were very large, or the forecast was not calibrated well, so it was misleading. The information was misleading the user as to what is the expected uncertainty of the migration that we could envisage. So the key messages from the work that we did for the Migration Advisory Committee can be summarized as follows. First, migration is really uncertain. But the extent of this uncertainty really depends on the type of migration that we are talking about. And it also depends on the underlying drivers. So migration is indeed unpredictable. Uncertainty is here to stay. This is something that we can't really ignore and we can't bypass. It is especially in the world of migration, this is the norm, not an exception. And the question thus becomes how to deal with this uncertainty, how to manage it in a sensible way. And from our looking at the various forecasting methods, none of them was clearly superior to the others. Some of the methods were very better or worse, depending on the data and the particular migration flow that we looked at. So there was no clear, conclusive evidence that any migration forecasting method would perform better in all possible circumstances. So there was a further, more statistical finding, which was that we shouldn't really be trying to predict migration by methods that assume stability if the process itself is very unstable, such as it was the case with new EU member state migration after the enlargement of the European Union in 2004, or such as it is the case with refugee and asylum seeker flows. It is probably a delusion to think that we can predict migration in a precise way. Maybe in North Korea, but pretty much everywhere else. We do not know what will happen to migration. And in fact, this means that probably the question about how to predict migration, how best to predict migration, might not be the best question to ask. In fact, this is a question that is rooted very much in the 20th century or even 19th century thinking that we can crack the social mechanism and use the knowledge that we have of that to predict as good as we can. I'm afraid not. I'm afraid we won't be able to do that, given how complex migration is, and especially how complex migration has become in the recent decades. So what we think is paramount now is a shift of perspective from thinking about forecasting, per se, to thinking about decisions and how this knowledge about uncertain future migration still can be useful for the decision makers. So in fact, what we need is an entirely different set of approaches. Approaches such as risk management, approaches such as prudent contingency planning, rather than trying to predict what is in fact unpredictable. And just as an example of one of the key findings, here is a snapshot from the report that we prepared for the Migration Advisory Committee, which presents a very simplified risk management matrix, which maps uncertainty of the different types of migration flows against their potential societal impact. So note that no migration flow has low uncertainty in this graph. It's just not the kind of process that would be characterized by low uncertainty. But within migration flows, we have different situations. We have long-term migrations of UK nationals, both ways, into the country and out of the country, which are not of huge political and social impact. On the other hand, we have the flows of refugees and asylum seekers, which are very uncertain and very impactful. So this is a way of summarizing the different types of migration flows, and also of showing where the policy priorities should be. They shouldn't be in the green areas, definitely. And besides, not on all types of migration flows does the government have control, or indeed want to have control. Presumably in democratic countries we wouldn't like to have control over who leaves the country amongst nationals. So this is the start. And just focusing on the red box here, so focusing on the refugee and asylum flow part of the overall migration. Here we are now faced with the refugee crisis in the year 2015, which is, contrary to the various claims, it's not really unprecedented, and it's not that it occurred has not really been a huge surprise. Crises do happen. Crisis migration does happen. We don't know when, we don't know where, we don't know how many people will come, but we know that these things do happen. So what we are faced with is a situation where we have a very uncertain flow that might happen, and when it happens, it does have a huge political impact, as indeed the refugee crisis has on the European integration of the very moment, and on many other aspects of social and political life. So what can be done? Our argument is that we need to move beyond the forecasts, beyond the attempt to forecast, and focus on the decision-making aspect of the policy question. So, if we specifically look at the refugee crisis, this is, I would argue, most importantly, the crisis of coordination and crisis of political will, rather than much else. What is lacking, and what this crisis has demonstrated quite severely, is that there are no contingency plans in place for crises like that across Europe. There is no coordination, there are no procedures there's no appropriate risk management in place for occasions such as this one. So this is exactly the gap that we have. And it's not to say that we can't do anything. We can prepare to some extent for the things that we know might happen. But that requires having some spare capacity in our countries to deal with the crisis. Exactly as is the case with the flooding in Cumbria at the very moment. Being prepared requires resources, and this is a political decision, whether or not to commit some of the resources that may remain idle for some time, but then that could be brought to help where needed. So this is something where we need to have an upfront debate and discussion about the various trade-offs of costs versus benefits of such mechanisms to deal with the uncertain events and their potential impacts. And also some trade-offs, as we have seen, especially in the discussions in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Paris, between liberty and security. This is the discussion to be had. And this is the discussion to be had instead of the discussion about how not to predict migration or how best to predict migration, which I would argue is probably not the right question to ask. Still, I think that this is something that maps the road towards a wider topic, which is managing uncertainty and risk. And what we need is will. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Jacob. That was very thought-provoking. Could we move now to Madeleine to respond to that contribution?
Great, thanks. Well, thanks for inviting me to participate. I thought this was a really, really interesting, thought-provoking report. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend that you do, or at least the 2 to 3 page summary, which is very clear and accessible and doesn't have any equations with Greek letters in it. I think this question of forecasting is one that we get a lot of inquiries about forecasting at the Migration Observatory. We spend a lot of time talking to journalists about migration. And I would say this is one of the most common questions we have whenever we're talking about migration levels. The next question is always, okay, well, what's going to happen next? Will migration always be this high? Will we see an increase in asylum seekers? And it is quite difficult to convey to non-technical audiences that we really don't know what's going to happen next. And so this is definitely a challenge. I'm not going to talk about the media side of thing. Jakob asked me to talk a little bit about what this means for the policy users of migration forecasts. Given that, of course, the level of migration affects a number of different areas of government, and the uncertainty about migration affects those areas of government. So just to run over a couple of areas that are affected. Essentially, any public service where that need to vary what they're providing based on the population of users will be affected by uncertainty of migration to some extent. So that would include education. I would need to plan the number of school places that are available in healthcare, the capacity of the NHS, public transport, the kind of number of users of various different modes of transport in the UK. That just to mention a few. Of course, there's also an impact on overall public finances. The level of migration affects tax revenues and therefore the resources available to be distributed across the various different activities of government. And of course, there are some areas that are affected very specifically by migration, like, of course, the Home Office, which needs to plan its staff resources to adjudicate visa or asylum or citizenship applications. So whether you're interested specifically in a population of migrants or whether you're interested in population growth overall, the findings of this report are equally relevant given that migration is the most uncertain part of population forecasts. So I should also say I think that the central conclusion of this report is I think, very sensible and plausible, which essentially I would summarizes the best response to uncertainty in migration forecasts is not to try and expect the statisticians to be able to reduce the uncertainty, but to learn to understand and make decisions that account for it. And I would say that thinking through how this might work in practice, how easy that is really depends on what kind of policy area we're talking about and what the constraints are. So we may migration itself is going to affect some policy areas more than others, and the impact of unpredictability is going to be different, and it's going to be higher, in particular in cases where resources need to be planned a long time in advance, and when there are high costs associated with having either too much or too little capacity. Now, I am not going to pretend to be an expert in the operation of all of these different policy areas, especially in front of such an erudite audience. But I thought I would just lay out a few different questions that one might think through in the case of different public services. The first is how much migration and the uncertainty about migration affects a particular activity. There are some services that whose user base is mainly not migrants, who may be much less affected. If you look, for example, at the age profile of migration, we know that migrants are much more likely to be in young age groups. And so public services that serve young people are much more likely to be affected by the uncertainty. Schools, for example, maternity services will have to think much harder about the uncertainty of migration than something like adult social care. At least when it comes to the customer base that they're serving. Adult social care, of course, has a workforce that is heavily dependent on migration, so that will be a different side of the equation. A second question is, how far in advance does capacity need to be planned, and how quickly can services respond if the levels of migration are different to what the central estimate was? Some services can expand relatively quickly by recruiting new staff, but in other cases, if you're talking about a large infrastructure project, for example, these are things that need to be planned, in many cases, many years in advance. Another set of questions, I think, is how much does it matter if the central estimate that you were planning around is way off? As Jakob mentioned, there are financial costs of having too much capacity. Extra capacity does cost money, but then there are also costs of having to expand your services in an unexpected way, because if you take staffing, for example, temporary staffing can be much more expensive than permanent staffing. Then there's another set of questions around the effect of high or low capacity on the quality of public services. So, for example, how much we care about being under capacity will have very different implications if we're talking about the visa processing or the waiting times of passport applications, compared to if we're talking about waiting times in the NHS or the availability of school places at the beginning of the school year. And I think that the top of that forecast range is going to be of particular interest to people planning services where there are the adverse consequences of being even a little bit under capacity are much higher. I'll close by saying there are a few additional challenges that weren't even mentioned here, which is that migration forecasts tend to be, we're talking about numbers at the national level, and just over absolute numbers of people, and that's not all that matters for people who are planning public services. Of course, immigration is extremely diverse. We have people coming in for a range of different reasons, whether that's skilled non-EU migrants, people, EU citizens exercising freedom of movement, non-EU family members, and all of these groups will affect public services in different ways. The relevance of migration may also, for a particular public service, will also depend on how long people stay. Often, for example, some services tend not to be used very much by people who are here only in the short term. And they will also be affected by the age and the income and a number of other demographic characteristics of those people. The other issue is that many services are planned at the local level, and this provides an additional layer of uncertainty. Overall, on average, it tends to be the case that migration concentrates in areas that have previously had higher levels of migration, and that provides some level of predictability. But there are always exceptions, like, for example, many areas in the East Midlands in the mid-2000s, for example, that simply weren't, that based on previous trends had no reason to expect much higher levels of migration. In fact, at the local level, even providing accurate data after the fact can be a challenge, let alone predicting it in advance. So certainly planning in the context of uncertainty is difficult. I should say this is not, we're talking about migration today. This is not something that's unique to migration. It's many different public services face uncertainties in planning for a host of different reasons. But I think, I hope that this very helpful report today will help improve these processes by really helping us to think through how you might implement, how you might respond to that uncertainty in practice. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Madeleine. Further response from Philip now, who, as I said, is at the University of Leeds, where he's Professor Emeritus of Population Geography, and I think your main work, Philip, is around currently is around the projections for the UK's ethnic groups.
Thank you very much. Yes, I recommend to everyone reading the Southampton report. They're excellent statisticians, and I wish I had their skills. Unfortunately, I don't. So the one or two statistics you'll see in my slides are much cruder, and no doubt would be thoroughly revised in the hands of Jakob and his colleagues. However, I don't have the luxury of not being able to make a forecast. I have to make a forecast because that's what I promised ESRC to do. I have a project running for 17 months, ending in May, which we are forecasting the future ethnic composition of the UK's population to the end of the century and beyond. Now, we've agreed with ONS, with whom we're working very closely, and with the other national statistical offices, that we will, our principal projection will follow the official projections, and in effect our projections will be a decomposition by ethnicity. But I'm going to show you the alternative, our kind of lead scenario, a little bit of the way we're feeling towards that. But the first thing I want to say is this term migration. As a geographer, I really get upset because to me it means any kind of move, including that from one flat to the next in your apartment building. And I really think we should put the name international in front of it, always. And that kind of then provokes the thought and the recommendation in Jakob's report that we shouldn't be dealing with net international migration. We should be dealing with the gross flows, the international immigration and the international emigration. And that makes us think a lot more. I've yet to meet a net international migrant. I've met lots of immigrants, and I know lots of immigrants. Okay, so it's just a statistical balance and not really something to be used in policy. Policy needs evidence, and this is a little vignette to illustrate that. I'm in discussion with somebody who should be nameless at the Department of Work and Pensions, who's charged, and said by the Prime Minister, actually it was a Prime Ministerial speech in the heat of the general election, that promised a number of things: to increase the ethnic minority employment by 2020 by 20%. And I, with my colleague David Owen from the University of Warwick, am now in discussion with the civil servants to try and gently suggest that's a completely crazy target, because it depends on the size of the population, and really they should be looking at trying to come up with a target that involves measuring the quality of employment in particular communities, and not quantitative indicators like that. Now, I should probably not in this House say, gosh, I would rather like the Prime Minister have, or his aides who invented that target, to have a few lessons from Jakob at Southampton about how to use statistics properly. Okay, should we actually have a target for migration? I don't think so. And here I'm quoting from one of the most eminent demographers in the world today, Professor Wolfgang Lutz, who heads 3 think tanks in Vienna, and thinks a lot about world population, has run recently a set of scenario projections. Interestingly, he ran the kind of probabilistic projections that Jakob and colleagues work would feed into. But we switch to scenarios. In this paper, which I'm quoting from, he's saying, don't worry about demography as in when you're setting your targets. Think about the welfare of the population and let the demography take care of itself. So fertility levels should be a consequence of ensuring the reproductive rights and choice for women. They shouldn't be the 1 child and now the 2-child policy as in China. I mean, we accept that in this country. Mortality levels shouldn't be subject to targets. They should be the consequence of improving people's health and longevity. And the mortality will be the result of the population processes going on. I project, for example, that deaths will increase very considerably over the next 30 years. But we shouldn't worry about it because people will be living longer and healthier lives. Simply that the baby boomers who came after me and myself will be dying off and will be contributing to the boom in the funeral industry. So, in consequence, international migration levels shouldn't be regarded as targets. They should be a consequence of labour markets, higher education, housing and social policies. And you should then deal with the consequences of those policies. If you don't like the consequences, you should reset those policies in terms of dealing with or attracting or keeping migrants away. And you should set them in the light of human rights. And I quote China's 1-child policy. There was a direct attack on the human rights of families and women in particular in China. UK's poor record in caring for rejected asylum seekers is a direct attack on their human rights. The take-home message is the goal of population policy should be to improve and utilise the human capital and well-being of all the members of the population. Okay, let's see how we've been doing in terms of trying to project migration. What targets have we been adopting? And I've assembled some recently published projections here. So here you can see the first 2 are just set in net terms. I'm very glad that ONS has paid attention to the messages from Southampton and now looking at the forecasting of immigration, the forecasting of emigration, and this is simply the statistical result that comes out of it, informed by the National Population Projections Expert Committee, of which we have at least one member here, John Sol, who actually recommended a lower. I was quite surprised by that they said that things are going to return to the past and it's all going to quieten down in the future. So that ONS really didn't really take their advice, which would be to stick with the previous plus 165,000 per annum net migration, but raise it back to a figure that they'd used previously. ONS also tried to deal with uncertainty by producing scenarios. It is awfully difficult to set the confidence limits in a proper scientific way around any of the variables of projection, but particularly migration, as Jakob's report has demonstrated. So ONS has been using scenarios. The high migration scenarios adds considerably more people in the future. And finally, the Leeds one that I've used in a recent, very interim set of projections, we also follow the high trajectory, really based on a look at the time series. So this is our guess, our model of what's going to happen. We fitted logistic regression curves to the time series and use long-term assumptions based on the limit of those of those projections. If you do a linear projection of immigration, it will keep on going up, so that adopting a limit means that some years will be way out, will be over-optimistic, and other years will underestimate. In effect, any projection you make is averaging all those crises that will occur over the next 50 or 100 years. And why do I think the level will remain that high? Because of the pressures in the rest of the world. Here they are marching through Europe, the great long march from the Middle East, from Syria in particular, but also other trouble spots like Eritrea and Afghanistan. And I think if you look at the demography of population change, particularly in the Mediterranean littoral and the Middle East, huge quantities of young people. And really those countries are not, apart from the civil wars and conflict and terrorism, even if it was peaceful, there are huge problems providing jobs and incomes and security, social security for that kind of that younger generation. So there's a tremendous migration pressure. Okay, so we have to what we have to do in our project is to estimate the international immigration flows by ethnicity. Very, very difficult with current statistics. The official statistics that we have in this country just don't give us the country of destination for immigrants, nor the country of origin in sufficient detail. So we're actually borrowing some strength, hopefully strength, from some very good work done by a couple of people on Wolfgang Witz's team on global migration flows. And this is a graphic which Nicola Zander, one of the researchers, prepared for that conference paper I mentioned. You'll see, just to reassure you, that in the UK, where are we? Spot the UK. Yes, here. We've only got one stream that actually belongs to the Premier League of international migration flows. But it does have a matrix of 196 by 196 estimated flows using a pretty robust methodology. And I'm going to be borrowing one row of that matrix and one column to help me in our forecasts of the origin countries, destination countries, and translate that into potential ethnicity. So that brings me then to how to improve UK migration statistics. They're awfully dependent on a very small sample, the international passenger statistics. We have administrative statistics from the Home Office, which are excellent, but they only really monitor immigration, and they only monitor immigration for people who need visas. So they're useful for some of the flows, but they're not comprehensive. So my suggestion would be to introduce comprehensive migrant records. In other words, everyone should fill in an entry card and an exit card. And I think there is an opportunity in the Prime Minister's discussions with other EU members about the terms on which Britain, he will recommend that Britain stays in the EU, to negotiate some kind of agreement in the current situation about measuring, not controlling, but just measuring the volumes of migration across borders in Europe. A little bit about my personal view about why current levels of international migration are good for the UK. They boost economic growth through maintaining the labour supply. And if you look carefully at the November statement by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you'll see he's using the most recent OBR projection of the growth of the economy, and that basically depends on labour supply. And OBR raised their projection by moving from a lower than principal assumption to the principal assumption in the ONS projections. And that produced the extra fiscal flows that enabled George Osborne to slow down austerity a bit. If you move to what I call the lead scenario, then austerity might well disappear. They provide international connections, they help our trade and diplomacy, they supply us with foreign language speakers and deal with our deficit in our abilities in so speaking. They supply UK research and development with world-class talent, and Jakub is my example of that, of course. They help UK universities be one of the country's best exporters, in effect, by importing students who pay these horrendous foreign student fees still, but they're not deterred. They know we provide quality education. And then finally, if you're at my age, you worry about what's going to happen when you get older, and that the healthcare sector, particularly the social care sector, is very dependent on immigrant labour. Who's going to keep you clean, wipe your bottom when you're 95? It has to be somebody, I think, who's prepared to take that job, and that's in the last few decades, that's been somebody from abroad. Final illustration of the importance of international migration to trade and foreign relations. I was asked a couple of years ago to give a series of lectures to the State Statistical Bureau of China on the census. These were provided by a little firm called Sinobridge that arranged these delegations from China to different places, including the UK. The lectures involve sequential translation. So I spoke a couple of sentences in English. It was then translated by the Chinese translator. Where was she educated? At the University of Leeds. Did she do a fantastic job? Yes, she did an absolutely fantastic job, for example, of explaining to the Chinese delegation what the difference between enumeration districts in the census were and output areas. Now, I won't go into that now. If you want to have a chat in over lunch, I'll explain all that. So there's my recommendation that international migration is an excellent thing to celebrate rather than worry about.
Thank you very much indeed for that. And for highlighting the lack of joined-up thinking, particularly on the OBR assumptions in relation to the economy being dependent on the migration which the Home Office are so keen to discourage.